April 5th, 1917. Post 2 again. It is 8:30, an hour past the regular time for the relief man to show up, and still no one has come. We no longer change shifts at 4 in the afternoon as we used to when we first went to N. The Boches have been deliberately firing on our ambulances lately, and we now change runs in the dark, in order to avoid any unnecessary driving in daylight. Most of us would really rather take the run in daytime, for with all due respect to German shells, it is no fun going over the old road in the dark. I brought my own blanket roll, hoping to have a quiet sleep, but they brought in frozen feet all night long, and I had to carry them back to Ville. I made 7 runs altogether, and carried 30 blessés. If I remember rightly, only 4 of them were couchés. All the remainder had that awful disease, pied gelé, where the foot slowly rots away and leaves the bone bare. I sat in a shell hole outside of the abri for a while this afternoon, watching the Boches pepper one of our 150 batteries about 200 yards behind me. They shelled it for over an hour, and I had a grand time listening to each projectile as it whistled over my head and broke a few seconds later in the woods beyond. I discovered, as it grew darker, and I could see the flash of the exploding shell, that the noise from this took several seconds to come to me after the explosion. And more than that, I noticed that the whistle continued for a short length of time after the shell had actually exploded. Therefore, I naturally concluded from this that the nearer you were to an exploding projectile, the shorter would be the whistle, and that it would be impossible to hear at all the approach of a very close shell. At supper tonight, the good news came, which we, and especially the Frenchmen, have been waiting to hear for months. Les États-Unis ont déclaré la guerre contre les Allemands. One of the brancardiers, returning from his furlough in Paris, broke the news to us. We were all below in the abri, making a great uproar over soup. A poilu can make more noise over a plate of hot soup than any other human being. When he came rushing down the muddy stairs and shouted to us what had happened, soup was forgotten for the moment, as we plied him with questions and pored over the copies of Le Parisien and Le Matin which he gave to us. So America was really in the war. President Wilson had made a great speech in Congress and denounced Germany. No longer would France regard her chances of final victory as slim. And each one of those simple poilus wrung my hand and asked me if I didn't think we would have our troops here soon. I don't believe I was ever prouder of America than at that moment, and as they pointed to a faded old banner hanging from their smoke-blackened ceiling, in which one could barely distinguish the colors, and I showed them the little American flag pinned to my coat, we realized that the bleu, blanc, et rouge and the red, white, and blue were one and the same thing. We talked together, or rather tried to talk, for a long time after the meal was over. Finally I went outdoors, for I thought Cookie, or whoever was to relieve me, might be here already. And as I walked through the trees, I thought of many things. Of Europe when the war would be over, of home, and if I would ever see it again. Suddenly I stumbled, and looking down to see what had tripped me, I saw a pile of dead soldiers, mangled by shell beyond all recognition. Some had been torn in 2 at the waist, and of others, very little but the head and shoulders remained. But they were Frenchmen. They had given all they had for France, and they must be treated accordingly. Tomorrow morning the priest would come to get the few personal effects of each man so that he could wrap them up and send them to their respective families. Sometimes these packages were very small, containing, perhaps, only a knife, a few cigarettes, and a wallet. But I have never seen one which didn't contain the pictures of his loved ones. After this, a couple of brancardiers will dig a rude grave nearby, the priest will say a few last words, the grave will be filled with earth, and a little wooden cross placed at the head to mark the spot. I hear someone coming now. He has his exhaust pipe disconnected and is making a terrible fuss. It sounds like Percy Pine of Princeton. Nameplate on the car. And if so, then it's Cookie, so assez aujourd'hui. April 6th. N again. I am on duty at N again, and am using a few leisure moments, trying to write by candlelight in Lefebvre, the chemist's cabin. It was once the vault of a deep wine cellar, but now, with the ruins of the chateau piled upon it, it forms a very respectable abri. Last night I carried 2 couchés to Ville from here, and on the way back I stopped at Jubécourt to see if I could buy a little wine which Monsieur Bouvier wants for Mass on Easter Sunday. The main street of the village is on a steep grade. I pulled up opposite the épicerie, and leaving the motor running, I wandered around the neighborhood to see if I could get the vin rouge. But when I found all the inhabitants in bed, I returned to the spot where I left the car. To my dismay, it was no longer there, and looking about, endeavoring to find what had become of it, I saw several 100 yards down the hill the indistinct form of an ambulance. I ran down to it and found it up against the stone wall of a house. I thought surely the front axle would be twisted or a wheel taken off, but luckily it had not attained any great speed on the way down, and had hit the wall rather gently. Except for the triangle being slightly bent, the car was unhurt. I suppose the vibrations of the motor running idle finally loosened the emergency brake, and since it was on a steep decline, the car had started forward. I had quite a busy night. The trip to N was very slow on account of the hundreds of ammunition wagons and companies of reserve troops which blocked the road. Finally, I arrived at the post and slept for 2 hours before I was called out with a grand couché. I drove pretty slowly, but got stuck somehow in a new shell hole near the entrance to the chateau. I couldn't budge the machine by myself, so I had to get my assis out to help me. They weren't very enthusiastic about the job, since they were suffering from their wounds, but they pushed as hard as they could, while I put on the power, and after 3 or 4 trials, the flivver climbed over the edge in fine shape. I carried the blessés as usual to Ville, and then returned to Monk. All the brancardiers were asleep here. I found a stretcher in one corner and a couple of blessé blankets on the straw. They were blood-stained and dirty, but in the dampness of the abri, much better than no covering at all. I curled up in them and managed to sleep until Craig came in at 3 o'clock and sent me back to N. They pulled me out of bed here a few hours later, with another load. The Boches are shelling Straffen Corner considerably now. Half a dozen new holes have sprung up in the road itself overnight, and there are 20 or 30 more on either side. But the town itself is worse. Every night it is crowded with burros, troops, supplies, and ammunition caissons going in every imaginable direction. I got caught in the jam near the barbed wire stores last night and had to wait 10 minutes until the road was clear once more. I shouldn't want to be a traffic cop in this place. 6 road workers were killed here by one shell last week, and one of the officers from the post was wounded by shrapnel yesterday. I am down in Lefebvre's abri waiting for Faith to relieve me. I hope he gets through the village all right. 6 or 7 volleys of 4 shells apiece have fallen there during the last 20 minutes. I guess there won't be so many coming when I leave, for they have been working pretty steadily. I hear Faith's whistle outside now. It means back to D'Emblay and a good night's rest. Photo caption 1. A quiet part of no man's land near St. Thomas. The ruins of Servant, a French village now in the hands of the Germans, are visible in the distance. In the foreground is the French barbed wire, and just beyond, the Boche. Directly behind this can be seen the 3 lines of the enemy's trenches. Photo caption 1. The poste de secours at Le Harzy. This station is the closest to the Boches that we ever had. It is less than 200 yards over the hill to no man's land. Photo caption 2. A firing trench and hand grenade post. The sign PP3X is the name of the trench. Photo caption 3. 2 poilus, one with a sunshade, resting in a front-line trench on a hot summer afternoon. It is just 100 yards to the Boches from here. April 7th. D'Emblay. Julien left today for Salonique. He goes on the mail truck Bar-le-Duc, then to Paris and Marseille by railroad, and finally on a slow little Mediterranean freighter to Greece. I was sorry to see him go. I will never forget our walk together last Friday when we visited the sausage beyond Jouy and ate our meager lunch of bread and confiture in the woods behind summer. Later, we walked to the summit of the big hill overlooking Bethlehemville. We went cross-country all the way, and at one place happened to wander across a lonely rifle range where a company of young soldiers were busy practicing. Luckily, they saw us in time, and we came out untouched. Further on, at the top of the hill above the village, we got a marvelous view of Mortham and could make out very clearly the 2 lines of trenches stretching along its sides. Beyond lay the Bois de Corbeau, and at its foot the ruins of Chatancourt. To the left, miles behind, we could distinguish the towers of lofty Montfaucon. Fort Douaumont was over the hills on the right, and we could see the outskirts of Verdun, which lay hidden in the valley of the Meuse. In the foreground, we could make out the French 2nd and 3rd line trenches, and here and there about Vingbille, a 75 shot out a jet of flame. The French had a number of sausages up, and we were able to pick out 2 Boche balloons, far behind their own lines. There were a few shells bursting in the valley, and big puffs of smoke rose regularly from Mortham. The artillery never seems to stop work here. Gilmore and I go souvenir hunting regularly now. We explored the old munition depot yesterday, which a Boche aviator blew up last summer. There were 40,000 loaded shells, both shrapnel and high explosive, stored there, and hundreds of empty casings, fuses, and duties. They all went up together because of one measly bomb. We brought home a quart of shrapnel and a number of compression bands. Gilmore has found the tip of a 380. It weighs about 40 pounds, and also enough parts of a 75 to construct the whole shell. Everybody seems to have gone souvenir crazy. Not only do we bring in all sorts of junk from the posts, but we spend every minute here making briquettes, paper knives, aluminum rings, and various doodads from Boche bullets. Whenever anyone brings in a hand grenade or a time fuse, we always take the thing apart. It's taking a terrible chance, but we seem to forget the present and look forward to our happy homes in years to come, with the relics we brought from D'Emblay reposing on the mantelpiece. My best souvenir so far is an old cavalry sword I got in Jouy Corps. It is over 4 feet long, has a wonderful edge, and dates back to 1822. I got it for a franc from an old man who seemed very anxious to get rid of it, and all he asked was enough money to buy a bottle of cheap wine. I think some officer left it there by mistake and never returned for it. It is a fine souvenir, and I hope I can get it back to America. There is a little attack on tonight, probably in the sector west of Avocourt. I hope it won't fill up post 2 and get me out of bed around 3 o'clock tomorrow morning. Just before I started writing tonight, while I was rummaging around my suitcase for a clean pair of underclothes, I haven't changed them since I wouldn't like to say how long, I found in the toe of one of my socks an egg, which I bought for the party in Jouy Corps 3 weeks ago and never used. Immediately I decided to fry it. I put some mahogany table legs on the fire, they make wonderful coals, and borrowed Gilmore's shell-casing dish to use as a frying pan. I had my Ford pliers for a handle, but just after I had broken the egg, I noticed that I had no lard. The kitchen was locked up securely, and all the Ford axle grease was packed away in the white truck. Suddenly I remembered that I had a jar of Vaseline, which I had brought with me from America. I dug it out of my duffel bag, rubbed it a little on the pan, dumped on the egg, and put it on the fire to cook. 2 minutes later, I was munching the result, a crisp, savory egg. The slight oil refinery flavor made me homesick for Pennsylvania. but this in no way prevented me from enjoying it immensely. April 10th, 1917. D'Emblay. Powell came back on the mail truck today from Bar-le-Duc, where he has been ever since we left Longueville, recuperating from a severe attack of pneumonia. Before we could tell him about the attacks we had been through and the all-too-frequent tir de barrage, he burst out with, "Say, fellows, you ought to have heard that big explosion from over the hills a few minutes ago. It must have been a shell going off." Ott's love for souvenirs almost finished him this morning. It seems that some poilu gave him a little round iron cylinder with 2 little screws on the end for a present. He brought it back to D'Emblay and told us that he had been given this little thing to use as a gasoline lamp. When he took out one of the screws, a queer, yellowish powder came out, and he put it in a pan of essence and set it on fire just to see what would happen. Luckily, he had enough sense to move away, for the cylinder, which was of course a rifle grenade, exploded and tore a hole in the ground as large as a bushel basket. The French mechanics and Decoupert, the lieutenant's secretary, none of whom have been up near the trenches, felt sure the Boches were shelling the village again, and wouldn't leave their abri for fully an hour. It rather pleases us to learn that the Frenchmen are just as scared as we are when they go out under fire for the first time. When we were putting a whole new front system on Haven's car near the entrance to the chateau the night of the second attack, Auguste and Léon were there to help. Every time when Léon would start to use his hammer, Auguste would seize his arm and say, "Doucement! The Boches are just behind that house, and they will get us with hand grenades if we make any noise." Then, before we were through, a heavy bombardment started up behind the church, perhaps 150 yards away. And each time that we heard the whistling of a shell, someone would yell, "Duck, fellows! It's a big boy this time." Auguste and Léon seemed to understand perfectly. At mention of the word duck, they would always disappear beneath the ambulance, and remain there until all was quiet again. To tell the truth, however, it isn't much fun waiting around with nothing to do while a car is being repaired. It's bad enough when you are busy working on the car, but when you have to wait for someone else to finish a job, you get a little nervous, especially when they are peppering the road. The star shells also worry one. You feel that the Boches have spotted you each time, and you try to figure the number of seconds before a shell will arrive. If we find it is impossible to repair a car sufficiently to tow it back to D'Emblay, or even to Montseville, it has to be left out there on the road to the mercy of the enemy. If they don't shell it, we fix it up the next evening, but if they do, it's goodbye ambulance. April 13th. D'Emblay. We are to leave soon for Ripoll, going to some village southwest of here. We may go tomorrow, or perhaps the next day, but at all events, our sojourn here will soon be over, and we will never return. The division has suffered tremendously, and they certainly deserve a rest. 5 of our men got the Croix de Guerre for work during the first 2 attacks. We had hoped that the section as a whole would be cited, instead of certain individuals being picked out from the rest. But it didn't happen that way. Houston, Craig, McLean, Walker, and Gillespie were the lucky fellows. Their citations came yesterday afternoon from the general of the division, and we celebrated in the evening with a big dinner. The sausage at Jouy was brought down this morning by a Boche aviator. I was standing outside the cantonment with Ott Kahn when the anti-aircraft gun started. Soon we caught sight of a tiny German plane, 10 or 12,000 feet above us. He was heading straight for the balloon, and descending so rapidly that for a while we thought he was falling. By this time the pilot of the sausage had signaled his men on the ground of his danger, and the great drum was reeling in wire cable at the rate of 20 miles an hour. But this was not fast enough to escape from the hands of the clever aviator, for suddenly, while he was still 1,000 yards above the balloon, he opened up his machine gun. We could hear its rat-tat-tats very clearly, although he was 5 miles away. 2 or 3 of the flaming bullets happened to pierce the hydrogen bag, and in an instant it was turned into a mass of flames. Before the pilot was able to jump from his basket and save himself in his parachute, he was overcome by the gas and flames. Barney Faith went over afterwards and found his aneroid barometer. Benny and I were talking before the fire in his room today. They don't cut up their wood as we do. Instead, they lug a 20-foot beam into the room, place one end on the hearth, and as it burns, shove it further in, Indian fashion. And Gilmore was attempting to make hot chocolate from a cake, which he couldn't shave down with a piece of éclat. When a knock came at the door, he yelled, "Entree!" and as the door slowly opened, he saw an old French couple standing on the threshold. This had been their home 6 months before, and now they had returned to look upon the wreckage. The woman wept when she saw the shell hole through the ceiling, the broken furniture which we were burning on our fire, and the heap of old family treasures lying in one corner. We said nothing. We couldn't say anything. But as they sadly departed, the man muttered, "It is not very nice, but after the war we will—" and we heard no more. Benny and I were silent, and Gilmore forgot about his cocoa for a few minutes. It had never occurred to us before, when we tore our house to pieces for firewood, and carted off all the books and ornaments for souvenirs, that people like these had actually lived in them, or would ever return. War becomes a little sadder, a little more real now, after we have seen what the civilian population has suffered. Before, D'Amblay was only a mass of ruined buildings. Now we see in it the destruction of hundreds of happy homes, and the scattering abroad of all the inhabitants. This week's American mail arrived today. I received 4 letters from the family, and 1 from Helen. She tells me the long-promised socks have finally been finished. But instead of sending them in the usual manner, she is going to mail them in 2 separate packages, a week or 10 days apart. So that, this is the brilliant idea, if one sock is lost at sea, she will have only 1 more to knit. One of the new 10-inch railway guns passed through town today and fired about 50 practice shots up to the Boche trenches on Hill 304, about 7 miles distant. Bradley and I heard before that the affair was going to come off, and got down to the tracks just as they began to fire. There were 2 cars in the outfit, one for the shells, and the other for the gun itself. Great jacks were propped under the south side of the car, presumably to keep it from being knocked over by the recoil. The shells, which happened to be 220s, were shoved from the other car up to the breech in a long trough. The brass powder casings were being carried by hand and pushed into the gun immediately after the projectile itself had been put in place. The men were working well and sending 4 or 5 shots a minute, which isn't bad for a gun of that caliber. One of the officers standing near told us if we got directly behind the gun and 20 or 30 feet away from it, we would see the shell emerging from the mouth. We couldn't find it at all at first, but after a few trials we managed to locate it almost before we heard the explosion. It looked like a small black ball and appeared to be shooting directly upwards, and if you strained your eyes, you could see it for 8 and sometimes even 10 seconds. April 14th. D'Amblay. The final orders have come. We will leave D'Amblay tomorrow morning and go to some town near Epernay, where the division will be en repos. Those of us who were not on duty today had to wash our cars again and then load each machine with forward parts, essence, gasoline, cans, and things like stoves and supplies which we carry from place to place. Old 464 has sunk way down on her springs with 3 20-gallon cans of gasoline and a box of the Frenchman's tools. I was on duty for the last time at N yesterday. It was pretty quiet in the morning, when I was poking about in the shell holes behind the chateau, hunting for time fuses. Lloyd and Harrison came out on Kahn's car about 11, on a camera hike. We had lunch with Lefebvre in his abri. Afterwards, I asked Monsieur Bouvier if he would take us up into the second-line trenches, or at least to the top of Hill 304, but he was a trifle reluctant about it and finally went off somewhere by himself. Another chap, a brancardier named Fouquet, whom I knew fairly well, had heard us talking, and as soon as Bouvier left, offered to go up with us. We jumped at the chance and set out immediately. Fully exposed to the enemy, who were less than 1 mile away, we started up the hill, which commences a few rods behind the post. As we drew near the top, we obtained a magnificent view of the whole surrounding country. Before us lay the summit of Hill 304, whose clayish-brown soil had been plowed up again and again during the 3 years the mighty struggles have been waged over it. To the east rose Mort Homme. Along its gentle, sloping crest we could distinguish the first-line German trenches, and 30 or 40 yards below them, the French. Now and then, a German shell exploded in the valley below, just to let us know the war was still going on. We had only gone a short distance beyond this point when it became necessary to enter a boyau, or communication trench. No man's land lay 400 yards in front of us over the next slope, and although we couldn't be seen here from a German outpost, we had to be very careful, for nothing lay between us and the Boche machine guns in the valley towards Mort Homme. Fouquet thought it better not to go in the open any longer, since there were 4 of us together, and it was a pretty clear day. Walking through the windings of the trench, we descended into the ravine, which the French called the Valley of Death. It got very muddy near the bottom, especially where sections of the trench had been caved in by shells. Finally, after we had sunk in up to our knees several times, Fouquet decided that we could take a chance on walking in the open again. A couple of shrapnel burst above us, but it was such a short distance now to the second lines that we didn't bother about going back to the boyau again. We came to the poste de secours, which we recognized some distance away by the Red Cross flag, stuck in a lump of clay outside the abri. We stopped for a few minutes to get warm and also to inquire if it would be possible to go to the first-line trenches. One poilu volunteered to take us up, but the doctor in charge told us it would be safer to make the trip at night. The trenches were in such bad shape from the last 2 attacks that one of us would very likely be potted by a German sniper in passing through a destroyed section. We were thankful for their kindness, and I promised to return at 9 that evening if there were no grand couchés to take down to Ville. When we left the post, a severe snowstorm was blowing, which permitted us to make the entire trip back to the chateau in the open. No souvenir hunter could imagine anything more wonderful. The whole side of the hill was literally strewn with hand grenades, unexploded German shells of every size, huge trench torpedoes, ready to be sent on their last journey, and bushels of éclat, compression bands, and time fuses. I found a perfect top of a German 150 6-inch shell, loaded with shrapnel, but it was so heavy I had to drop it after a few hundred yards. I also picked up 5 Boche fusées, some pieces of compression band from a 10-inch shell, and the base of a torpedo. I put them in the side box of my car as soon as I got to the post again. Bouvier heard about our plans for returning in the evening a short time after we arrived, and was so opposed to our going that we gave up the idea for the moment. Sammy Lloyd and Harrison started for Montseville not long afterwards, and I went back to D'Amblay, where I now am, Bradley having relieved me at 8:30. It will be hard leaving our cantonment here tomorrow, for although we will be delighted to have a short rest in some quiet little village, nevertheless our work here has been very interesting, and we do not look forward with much pleasure to the repos life of Longueville and Jubecourt. Photo caption 1. In a mine under no man's land, 15 feet from the Boche trenches, several tons of powder are piled up in the background. 2 of the poilus, listening with microphones to the conversation of the Germans across the way, will set off the mine at the proper moment. Photo caption 2. In another mine with Amulot, the happy poilu in the center. The men are working with the aid of a carbide lamp. Photo caption 1. A mine crater after the explosion. It is more than 200 feet long. 40 French soldiers were killed here. Photo caption 2. A supply station in a front-line trench at La Harizie. Here are collected periscopes, hand and rifle grenades, corkscrew barbed wire stakes, and rifles. A gas alarm gong hangs above the poilu on the left. Photo caption 3. Midsummer in the Argonne Forest.